Podcast for podcasters by podcasters. Podcasting Smarter is the official podcast from Podbean, featuring podcasting interviews, best practices, and helpful tips. We're here to give you the tools, resources, product updates, and news to help you get started podcasting and keep your podcast growing.
Hello everyone. Hello and welcome. My name is Norma Jean Blanky, and we are so excited that you're here with us today. We have an incredible panel and an incredible live event for you here today. So we are so excited that you've joined us. I'm going to read our brief intro and then we will hand it over to our host. Welcome back everyone to Podcasting Smarter and our June live event, Podcasting with Pride, Strategies for Inclusive Representation, hosted by Kira Dineen of the DNA Today podcast, and featuring Sally Chum, CEO and founder of AQ Studios and the Afro Queer podcast, and Sean Howard, CEO and founder of Flight Path and co-founder of Fable and Folly. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Podcasting Smarter has live stream sessions just like this one with top podcasters and industry experts. We also have exclusive recorded episodes on the Podcasting Smarter podcast, so make sure to check that out as well. This event is one of many resources and events Podbean offers free of charge to empower you to launch and succeed in your podcasting journey. We also have some great events coming up in July on how to maximize video for your podcast and everyone's favorite topic these days, AI. Podcasting Smarter is brought to you by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to over 640,000 podcasts. To start your podcast, head over to podbean.com today. And now we'll get started, and I will hand it off to Kira Dineen of DNA Today. Thanks, Kira.
Thank you, Norma Jean. I'm very excited to be celebrating Pride in this episode. So we're going to be talking about podcasting with pride and strategies for inclusive representation as podcasters. So I wanted to introduce our two panelists here. We have Sean Howard, who is the CEO and founder of Flight Path and the co-founder of Fable and Folly. And we have Sally Chum, who is the CEO and founder of AQ Studios. And before we hear a little more about their podcasting journey, wanted to kind of introduce myself as well. I'm Kira Dineen. I use she, her pronouns. And as Norma Jean gave me a wonderful introduction, I'm the host for this webinar. I identify as queer, so I am in the alphabet mafia, as we say. And I am a podcaster. I do about 10 shows, or have in the past, do some now, with my main show being DNA Today. And we're celebrating 300 episodes this summer, and in the fall, 12 years. So Sean, I would love for you to be able to kind of just kick us off with starting your journey into podcasting, just so people kind of know where you're coming from.
Sure. My partner and I, we had been dabbling with some podcasts. I had been doing some with a friend, or more around, I don't know, I guess more industry kind of stuff. And then my partner, Eli, he was writing some fiction. And basically, we started playing with this idea of launching an audio fiction podcast way back, like insanely way back. And that's where Alba Salis came from, which was our first show, and which is been a really interesting journey to watch that show grow and sort of, I guess, watching me and Eli come out publicly through that process in that show, right? That was a bit of a journey there over the years. And then that led to the formation when COVID happened up in Canada. The Canadian government was paying everyone this crazy amount of money every month. Sorry, all Americans.
I was going to say, we didn't get
that
much.
But I was like, well, this will be over in 4 months. Yeah. I was like, this is going to be over in 4 months. What should I do while this is going on? And that's how Fable and Folly got formed, to represent independence in the fiction space.
That is amazing. I love that story. And Sally, can you fill us in on a little bit of your background and how you became a podcaster in the industry?
Sure, yes. I actually was a journalist for quite a long time. So my podcasting journey probably started in 2002. I was a journalist for National Public Radio, and then again for PBS, and eventually for the Times. But back then, podcasting, no one really knew what it was. So I was a podcast producer kind of before Serial became Serial, which then launched podcasting into the stratosphere. But after I was done being a journalist in New York, I actually moved to Nairobi, to Kenya, to found an LGBT digital media organization called None on Record. And so I worked with a lot of LGBT groups across the 54 countries, documenting oral histories, teaching activists how to use digital tools to document what was going on in their communities, the stories of their organizations. We made lots of documentaries, and then we set up shop in Nairobi for a decade doing that kind of work. And then we launched a show called Afro Queer. That was our first official podcast out of our media company. And that show, it just took off from the first season, which was really exciting for us. And we're now in production on the 5th season, which is also very exciting for us. But that was a documentary podcast that told the stories of queer Africans from across the continent and the diaspora. And from there, we then launched AQ Studios and now have another show called Adventures from the Bedrooms of African Women and another show called Afro Foodie. So we've been able to do very queer shows and then also branching into telling narratives across Africa that aren't told often at all. And so that's how I got my start. So I've been at this for quite a while.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that means you're an OG in the field. I mean,
Amazing.
starting in the early 2000s, definitely. And one thing that I want to, really open up in terms of our conversation today is how we're integrating inclusivity into our shows. And that's going to be different depending on the kinds of shows we have, and especially with you guys having such different premises for your shows and the way you're doing them. I think it's great that we can hear from your different perspectives. Sally, did you want to start us out on just how you integrate that inclusivity aspects into your show? I mean, there's so many ways to take it.
Yeah, I think because our shows focus as Africa as the starting point and then out into the diaspora, that means that we are looking at 54 countries, thousands of languages, thousands of cultural practices. So it's always interesting to make a show that has such a wide possible audience. So some of the things that we have done is to definitely make sure we don't always do the shows in English, which has been a great boon to our listenership. So, for example, our next show, a lot of it will be done in French. Other ways that we do it is that when we go into different countries, so there's an idea that everyone in Africa knows about every other country in Africa, and that's not the case. So a lot of our shows are also really kind of educating and bringing in the culture and the context and the religion and the legal structures and the cultural structures to other people on the continent, so they understand how queer identity is experienced in these different places. So we take a lot of time with that storytelling. We also, because we are an LGBTQ, etc. show, we also make sure that we have enough representation of different kinds of stories and different kinds of storytellers within our seasons. And so that's been a really exciting undertaking for us as well, especially in Afro Queer, to make sure that a lot of variety of voices and experiences have been heard. But we are at our core journalists, so we report a lot of our stories out, and we do our best to fact check. We do our best to represent well the storyteller and to also just respect the storyteller who's giving us this story. So that's where I will start from our point of view in terms of how we make sure that we're inclusive.
Yeah, and certainly when you're talking to people that, as you said, it's a lot of their personal narrative. So capturing that as being nonfiction. Whereas, Sean, on your side, you're more in the fiction world. So how does this apply to the shows that you're creating and some of the characters? And how is this a little different when it comes to the audio fiction space?
Yeah, I think there's a couple lenses there. The first lens is fable and follic. So we have some shows that we create. We call them originals, but we represent over 75 producers in the independent fiction space, and so I think what began by trying to understand our audiences, right? Because we didn't start with I think representation at the core. Again, I was just sitting at my desk one day and I was like, why can't independent fiction producers make a living out there? Why is this not possible? Because no one, right, could do it back in the day. And so I think what emerged was that audio fiction has one of the most diverse listener bases out there. Fiction is just it's very different. Every year, there's another study put out by Edison or whoever, right, about who listens to podcasts in total, and I call it the Angry White Men study because every year that's what comes out, right? It's a very set older demographic that just emerges from those studies in aggregate. And what we started to realize really quickly in fiction is it's not that way. It is younger. It is probably the most identity diverse, right, out there, like sexual identity, every kind of identity. And so that started really the process for us to realize, this isn't just about our journey as storytellers and supporting people from LGBTQ and other everywhere. It was also realizing our audience is very different in this ecosystem. And one of the problems we also recognized was that where we're weak, and I think a lot of podcasting reach is weak, is ethnically diverse. We have a problem there, and it's not talked about a lot, right? Reach into different ethnicities is something that we don't always do well at. So at Fable and Folly, we're a representation network. We're trying to make money for podcasters, and those of us who are in this business, we know that to make money in podcasting, you need to have reach. You need to have numbers, right? We need to have a show we can sell. But our approach to diversity is we make sure that we're bringing on producers. So we basically, we don't have like a minimum that we hold the line on in order to bring a show on, right? We have a process we developed to try and bring on more representation to cover those places where more support is needed and clearly more reach is needed, right, within our ecosystem. So that's probably my best answer. Personally, I can talk about that was just a bizarre journey, right? We were just starting by writing a story, and neither my partner or I were out, really, right? And suddenly there was just this thing that happened in telling the story where it sort of became more and more apparent, right?
Yeah, that's so empowering to hear that was part of your coming out journey of like through podcasting, because I don't hear that too much in terms of people that I've talked to in the queer community where we also have that intersection with podcasting. It's like, after they've come out, they're like, I want to do something in the space. And but it's really interesting and unique that for you and your partner, podcasting was part of that stepping stone to publicly come out, as you've been talking about. And that fiction podcast, it's so interesting that it is such a vastly growing area, especially for kids. And I just think about all the kids listening to these new fiction podcasts. I'm excited and hopeful that a lot of these shows, certainly yours with Fable and Folly, that they're being exposed to lots of different characters to inspire them and just also be exposed to different walks of life, including, people and characters within our community. I think that's just so important. But as you've kind of both brought up, there's challenges that we face in terms of addressing some of these topics of diversity and inclusion. How have you guys been focused on identifying what those obstacles are and then coming up with a game plan of, how are we tackling this? I mean, Sean, earlier you were talking about how, there's not enough representation and kind of trying to make that better. But also, I think within that, when you have just an audio show, when you're talking about different aspects, when you just have a voice, it's hard to tell necessarily who that voice is representing. So is there ways, going back to you, Sean, of ways that you and your partner and other team members are including aspects so that listeners are more aware of what that full character is? Because audio is a different format than when you see a character on TV and you get a really good snapshot of who they are and what they're representing.
Yeah, I think it's having the voices at the table telling the stories, right? I mean, it's so easy to co-opt someone else's story or someone else's culture, right? And say, ooh, I'm now doing X, right, for representation. But I think it's all about the storytellers. So for us, it's about having those voices. Because I think in audio, like audio is way more powerful than we give it credit for, right? We can tell a difference as a listener between a take that was in a room with the door closed and a take in a room with the door open. And when you try to cut those two together, they don't cut. And that's like a tiny change in the room. So I think a lot translates. And I also, so yeah, for us, it's about how do we get more voices and writers from diverse points of view in our community, outside our community, writing those stories. That's sort of been our focus. And obviously, there's, I think, a real shift over these last, well, it's been for a long time now. I think there's been a lot of, in the independent fiction space, a lot of wanting to have representation in the actors that we bring to the table. That's I feel like that's actually been important since the beginning. But getting the storytellers, more diversity in the storytellers to the table is still an ongoing challenge.
Right, of having both of those aspects of that. At first it comes to mind, oh, well, having the actors, come from different areas, but then also you need those storytellers to be part of that. And Shelly, with Sally, with your show and shows, plural, that's a big part of capturing people's authentic stories. And you being someone that has a background with NPR, you have that journalistic background that must be so key when you're part of these shows. What is often your mindset and different questions and things for you to be able to be discussing some of these aspects of, the obstacles of diversity inclusion while you're having these interviews? Because from, the tip of the iceberg research I did, I mean, you've done over 1,000 first person narratives of people in the LGBTQIA plus community. So you've got quite a lot of practice at this. So what have you learned over time of being able to capture all of that?
Yeah, I mean, I was an oral historian for a very long time, and so I was lucky to learn on the go, but also have quite a bit of training and mentorship in terms of how to really deeply listen to people. I think it's really interesting when we talk about diversity, equity, inclusion, especially because my main studio is in Nairobi. I'm on loan to Los Angeles right now, but I usually am on the continent. So our context for diversity, equity, and inclusion is very different. But being back in the U.S., there's an added component to that. So I'm going to really talk about that first. I think telling African stories and trying to push them out into the mainstream, into the global sphere, is a lot of, in a macro way, what happens with stories of people of color here in the US, also probably North America more generally. And I think what we are often dealing with is getting people to understand that there's a universal human component to the stories that we're telling. And I think Afroqueer was one of those, probably our first show to jump completely over, where we had listenership that was not specifically African and also just not specifically queer, because there was a way that the storytelling was done where it was done in a way that was universal, right? And so it's also in some ways kind of trusting the audience or pushing the audience to listen to something that they might not normally listen to. Being back in the US, I definitely feel that we are very much siloed. Like, this population is going to listen to this thing. This population is going to listen to this thing. And what ends up happening in those ways is that the resources and the effort to build those audiences that might not always be there. And in the US, we have definitely statistically don't have a strong audience with people of color here, particularly after, if public radio looks at its stats, they're going to see that there's definitely a chasm, something that they're trying to work on, right? But because we don't put the resources and the time into building those audiences up and giving them something that they really want to listen to, integrating, if for lack of a better word, those audiences into our larger mainstream media distribution platforms or houses, we're always going to have this challenge. And when we talk about also selling stories, like what's going to sell, we have a tendency here to not necessarily look at the smaller audiences, which might be people of color, which have a tremendous economic power here. But sometimes when companies are looking at what's going to sell, they're going to try to look at the widest audience possible. And my point has always been that if we want to cultivate these audiences, and if we're looking at it from purely capitalistic terms as people who are going to consume and purchase our media, then we need to invest the money into creating things and also marketing to that audience effectively. Now, the other thing, on the other hand, being a diaspora African, I was born in the US. I'm Senegalese American. I've lived on the continent for a decade. I'm back in the US. I move around a lot in the world. And I think one of the things that's always very difficult is having people understand that, African stories and African audiences are important. And so a lot of what I do when I'm even in London, podcast show, or, here at Podcast Movement or wherever I am, is just trying to talk about what's going on the continent, who's listening to what. Our listenership is quite young. It's quite young. It's quite urban. We've been mobile for a long time, so people are listening to podcasts. Spotify just came in a couple years ago and kind of really blew up African podcasting. So now podcasting is becoming very, very much more mainstream than it was even 4 years ago. But we also have YouTube. YouTube is the biggest podcasting distribution platform on the continent as well. So that's why we're moving into these visual aspects of how do we tell shows. But this is the challenges. It's almost oftentimes trying to prove that our audience matters and that it needs to be invested into, and it can't be an afterthought after you've exhausted North America, after you've exhausted Europe, and you're looking for another market to come into. Now you want to put resources into Africa, and then you want to make sure that they're a market that has a buying power. So this is speaking primarily on just like financial capital, money terms and business terms. But in terms of talking to people and interviewing people, my approach has always just been to listen and to treat people as human beings. If I make a mistake in an interview, if I, misgender someone, I need to correct that quickly and honestly and fast and as fast as possible. And I also have to communicate that to my team. So these are the ways that I would try to really make people feel comfortable. We don't share stories, for example, unless we have absolute, permission to do so. We've oftentimes had to maybe pull stories just out of thoughtfulness to people's safety, which is a difficult conversation to have with someone who really wants to tell a story, but we don't have the capacity, or we're not sure that this story is not going to put them, in harm's way. So we've had to do those kinds of things. But generally, we put care first before anything else that we do. And I think because of that, we have a lot of trust with our audience. And we've been able to get stories that, I think would be difficult if we didn't have, over a decade of trust with the audience there on the continent. And so that's how we've approached it. I think we've been pretty good. Our track record is pretty good, but when we do make errors, we have to fix them right away. And I think we're very good about communicating that. So, yeah, I think that's a long way to answer your question. I tried to cover a couple of things that have come up since we've started talking. Yeah.
Yeah, no, that's wonderful. And I think you bring up a lot of good points, especially to make guests feel very comfortable, to disarm them, to say, hey, like giving them a little bit of background before maybe hitting the record button. Is there aspects or a to-do list kind of before you start an interview to accomplish this so that guests that you're interviewing, Sully, feel that they're in a safe space, and information you get beforehand to make sure that you are identifying them in a correct way? You mentioned, we all have misgendered people by accident. And something that I have just learned is to say, oh, I'm sorry, I meant this, and then just move on and not, stick in that too much. Just promptly apologize, correct, and move on. So I think that's one thing that comes into mind. But even when you're introducing a guest on the show, are you saying their names, their pronouns? Do you just naturally let that come up? What is your approach as an interviewer?
Right. So any interview that I'm doing, so I should tell you, I also have a team. So I have a team of producers that work with me on all of the shows. At this point, I executive produce the shows. So generally, when I'm entering into an interview, those producers have already put together a pretty extensive producers pack. So we know quite a bit about the person that we were able to find in our own research. And one of the producers has already done a pre-interview at that point as well. And we do that, a lot of that kind of prep and communication with the interviewee, because we want them to, when they finally are sitting down to do the actual interview, to feel really comfortable with us as a team. That's very, very important to us because it'll come out in the interview. So usually when that person is finally in front of me, we've probably already had a lot of communication or interaction for at least a week or two, or a month even. And so what I usually say is like, okay, we're going to have a conversation. And, we're going to just talk about your experience, depending on who the person is. And I just want them to let me know if there's something that gets uncomfortable. If they don't want to talk about it, it's totally their choice. I am not pushing them to share parts of the story that are difficult for them, and to stop the interview at that point, and we will move on, and it will not be an issue. Because I think also sometimes it's really important to give space to people to assert when they need to set a boundary, because it's very difficult sometimes for people to set boundaries when they get into interview space for themselves. So it's something also that we established pretty early, which is that if this is going to be challenging, if you feel uncomfortable, tell us. We are very okay with that feedback, and we will completely move forward. And I think sometimes when communicating just how the structure or the framework of the interview in this way, it helps people to feel very comfortable to tell their story. So there's a lot of that goes on. We do a lot of check-ins and making sure people feel good. And also people, we don't actually do this anymore, but we used to allow people to listen to the episode before it published, but we don't do that anymore. not because people stop it, but because we don't have time. So no. We'll publish, but if someone gives us feedback, which is pretty rare, then we'll make an amendment to the audio. So, but yeah, it's sometimes a collaborative process. We get pitched a lot as well from our audience. And so if someone pitches us a great story, we'll bring them in to produce it with us. So right now we're working on a really fantastic story from Nigeria about a singer from the 60s who was a cross-dresser and was very popular, was very loved, and would travel across the country singing to chiefs and politicians. And so we were pitched this story, and that producer has traveled all throughout meeting people who met the singer, their family members, and trying to really understand what changed in the country where this could have been acceptable, 40, 50 years ago, but oh gosh, more than that now, huh? But not acceptable, now, and like how that's changed. So it's always a really fun collaborative process making Afroqueer. And we try to make it as empowering as possible for everyone involved.
Yeah, that's amazing. You're going to have to send me when that podcast has been released, since it sounds like you're in the production phase of that. It's very exciting. And Sean, on your side of looking at more working with fellow podcasters, how do you kind of create that inclusive space for like coworkers? And it sounds like, you're a co-founder, so you're high up on the totem pole in that sense. How do you create that space for people to feel comfortable in being themselves as a podcaster at work, and also maybe even channeling some of their own experiences into characters they're playing, or producers to be just being open and maybe providing notes of, hey, maybe we should be doing this differently, or, how do you create that safe space for people, again, on the opposite side of what Sally was really saying in terms of guests now talking about fellow podcasters?
Yeah, well, Fable and Folly is a very small organization with, even the roles that we have are mostly honorariums, right? Like we have someone who's in onboarding and reviewing of submissions to join the network, and who ran our DEI process. Anyway, everything in our network is volunteer, and we meet every month. So we have some tools that we use with our producers when we meet, and we obviously have policies in place, which are important, like how we're going to handle things, right, that come up, to just make it clear to everyone. But I think when I'm thinking about safe space, I think of we have a show called Civilized that I perform in, which is an improvised comedy, dark sci-fi comedy. And we perform with some amazing comedy improvisers. And we also perform live at fringes and different festivals. And so there it's been a really interesting process, because we want to tell stories that are important. And when we bring a guest in, they're really empowered, obviously working with an audience in an improv comedy show, but they're very empowered to tell the stories that they want to tell or that come up. And so we do spend some time both working with a new guest on setting up how they can let us know if they're not comfortable, right? Most comedy improvisers are pretty comfortable with that kind of thing, but we make sure we have those conversations. But then also how we set it up with the audience, right? So we will introduce things like our pronouns and their pronouns, and we will also we just create a very safe atmosphere, and we're very open with the audience about what we're doing. But yeah, it's again, I think it comes down to how do we empower the voices and make sure they feel safe to tell those stories. And to be honest, that's an area where we're still learning, right? Like how do we, when we know we have a lack of representation with a certain type of storyteller, right? Like, how do we let them know that it will be a safe space, right? Like, how do you even get them to want to think they can approach, or that this will be a safe space? And so we tend to work a lot with our existing producers. How can we empower them? How can we enable them to create their own groups and start talking about, right, not even our network, but more about what we're all trying to do, which is get more representation, right? And so that's something that's worked really well, just empowering key producers who are like, hey, one of them wanted to go out and start a group to talk to other creators that are of the same ethnicity that they were, and they wanted a safe space, and they didn't have the money to create that. So we just helped create that space and empower them to do that. And that it's stuff like that we try and also make sure we're doing, because I think it's important to recognize, I think Sally said it really well. There are barriers to telling stories, and audio fiction came out of nowhere. It did not come from big budgets, right? It was individuals working with their friends with a microphone to create these first stories, right? If you go back to the beginning of audio fiction, and it's very small in podcasting. It's not like audiobooks where 80 or 90% of audiobooks are fiction. It's the exact opposite. There's this tiny pool, 3 to 5% maybe of podcast listeners know what audio fiction is or listen. So it's this very tiny sort of nascent community that came out of this this space where there was no barrier, very low barrier, right? You didn't have to get approval from LA. You didn't have to sell your idea. You could just you could create and tell your story. But even in that environment, there are barriers that stop people from being able to tell their story or get it out to the world or get an audience, or right. And so I think some of the work we're doing is constantly trying to understand what are those barriers, and is there something we can do to help them feel like there's at least another place out there. We're not the only that is open to representing and trying to let them tell their stories and get a wider audience.
And even more important, because it's such a small niche within podcasting, to have representation, because there's only so many shows in this space that are active and currently producing episodes. And for people that haven't checked out audio fiction podcasts, like, you are missing out. If you even like audiobooks, this is a whole nother level, because you are just immersed. And, there's been ones that I've listened to over the years that I'm just like enamored by, and you feel like you're just in that world. And it really is amazing, like you said, that there is that low barrier, that you can get a relatively cheap microphone and hole yourself up in your closet, which I'm sure there's some kind of funny joke or something about being queer, going in the closet as a podcaster. Maybe you guys could workshop that for me. But with that, I think it's just so incredible that you can create this show and get a product out there without having to have this massive budget. And when you're making films, like, it's just so different. And one thing I was thinking about when you guys were kind of talking about these topics is other like strategies you guys use to maintain your authenticity in these shows while ensuring you're not alienating any part of the audience, of either over explaining concepts so that people understand, or not explaining concepts at all. And you're like, well, if they don't understand this aspect of queerness, then, that's lost either in the story or the interview. Sally, did you have any thoughts on that, of just striking that balance of kind of maybe explaining terms versus just having them come up in conversations and listeners figuring it out with context clues?
Gosh, I was actually, when you were asking that question, I was trying to break down the process there in my head. Like, how do I do that? What are the choices that we usually make there? Okay. Honestly, that's a tough one. I mean, it's like so ingrained in my training, but I like to think I'm really good at that. But I think a part of it for what we're doing is that this is actually probably a better way to respond to this. We have what we call like our sort of like producer's room. So once we have what we think is probably the strongest cut, we bring in people who have never heard this before, have literally no idea what we might be talking about. Like, it's coming from a place they've never been. And then we have them do a listen. And usually when that happens, we can see the gaps, we can see the holes, because when you're with a story for a really long time, you don't even realize that you are filling in things that you need to maybe explain to the audience. And so in that case, that's when you have a set of listeners that are outside of your team, even outside the experience, who can listen and say, huh, what does this mean? Or I don't quite understand this part here. Or like, who's talking here? And those kinds of things are really important in the construction of the story. So that's one of the ways that we've been able to really do that. I think in terms of training our team to do that, has been really sort of them getting out of their own, like, not bias necessarily, but it's almost like taking their own experience and putting it aside and putting it together like it's building blocks. But we do have a really strong outside audience that will tell us if we're being, patronizing or we're over explaining something. So we have a pretty good team there. Yeah.
And just like everything else, you learn as you
gotta
go.
say that
And Sean, go
it's
ahead.
really hard, right?
Yeah.
No, I'm just gonna say it's so hard.
Yeah.
Like imagine you've got the story to tell, and you don't call things out. And this recently happened on one of our amazing shows. And you just work in a new character that is coming from an LGBT point of view, but from an ethnicity that's not acceptable generally, right? It's that, and you just treat it like normal. And this producer and creator that was telling this story was just doing it from a place of like love and acceptance, and it was traumatizing for them to read the feedback and comments that were coming in. And so I think one of the key things we try to tell people as they're growing these stories is you basically have to learn to never read the comments. And I hate to say that, but you know what I mean? There's a point at which you need to be in a special place, and the special place for me is never. Some people can get to a special place where they can read some of this feedback, right? But it can be brutal. Like, it can be really awful, the feedback that you can get when you put something out in the space. So I just want to call a spade a spade. And so sometimes it's like literally just saying, you know what? We're doing the thing we're doing. We did it in the way that is we believe in, and we're just going to move on and hope that we're not crossing into an area of unsafety, right?
That's
I think,
really
yeah.
key.
And I would
Sally,
say,
I'd love to hear your
I
thoughts
went
on
through
that
this thing called sorry, we have a little delay. Yeah, I went through something called the Google Podcast Creators Program, and they drilled this thing into us they would say feedback is a gift. Now, I don't know if I thought it was a gift when I got there, because it was pretty brutal at times, but I learned to be able to listen to it and kind of like, in some ways, when someone's giving you harsh feedback for something you really love and you think is really good and you don't want to cut it, that's hard, right? When someone misunderstands your intention, and maybe is offended by what you do, that's also very difficult when that's not your intention. But I do think that there is something within feedback where we can learn, and we also have to be discerning. Like, some feedback is not useful, and I think that's also something I learned in that process as well, to be okay when I can say, okay, that's not really useful, and I'm okay with that, but there is also sometimes where it is really useful. And so I do try to take it, as I don't think it's always easy. And I think, as Sean pointed out, but there's something to learn too, when people are really trying to give you feedback in a way that's constructive and actually really trying to help and support, better storytelling or stronger storytelling or something maybe you didn't see. I think it can be useful. I just think we live in the age of social media and people are just extremely harsh. So it's just like, there's a balance there.
Yeah, there definitely is.
Beware YouTube comments.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that one
They're
can be
harsh.
a tough area. And
Yeah.
it's hard because we want to protect people that are involved in this, right? So, Sally, on your end, it's like you even mentioned earlier, sometimes you guys will pull a story because you're like, the safety of that individual may be at risk if we release this, or their identity may be revealed. What are aspects you think about as a podcast producer? Like, I say podcaster is kind of the umbrella term. But in terms of being able to protect people while still creating content that is really helpful and embracing for our community, because there are fellow podcasters that are watching, listening to this and thinking, how do I strike a balance like Sally's doing to get these stories out there, but making sure that we're not crossing lines where the guests we're interviewing could be in, and I hate to say it, but peril in certain countries. This is illegal to be gay. And that's something that we need to be mindful of. And you have so much more experience in this area than I do.
Yeah, I think it's one of those. So we do, the nature of our work was going into communities and working with activists, in rural parts of countries and the cities. So we really started to learn where some of the higher stakes were in some of these like social economic structures, even within the 54 countries. And so in some ways, just having that deep knowledge of how, what the laws are, what the cultural practices are, even down to if a woman comes out versus, a man comes out, if a trans person comes out, like what could possibly happen in these different cultural contexts has been really helpful for us in terms of how we navigate our work. We also had a lot of risk. We have a lot of risk assessment training that we've been doing over the last decade. So even before we would go into communities to work with activists to document their own stories, we would have risk assessments of that space. So it's like, what are the legal frameworks? If someone were to be arrested, how will we get them out of jail? What's the support system for that particular organization? What are the economic resources to get them out of situations if something were to happen? What's the possibility that we will get arrested? These are literally the things that we had to really think about every time we traveled, even with my team. Like, what's the risk of my team going in there and getting arrested? And if that happens, who are the lawyers that we need to call? Like, these are the things that, as a team, we're thinking about constantly. So with that, I think we have to communicate often to the storyteller. For example, if that storyteller is still living at home with their parents and they're not out. If that storyteller doesn't have the means to take care of themselves, if they were to be kicked out of their home, are they in an environment where if their identity is revealed and it's a small community, what does that mean for them? Like, these are all the things too that we have to really discuss with the storyteller as well. We did have a point, in this movement on the continent where people were feeling so empowered, and this was a beautiful thing of being able to have watched it over the last 15 years. And this is why I got into audio oral history, was because people didn't want to have their face shown, in 2004, 2005, when I was really starting to ramp up collecting. So now we're in, 2024, and people are putting things on Instagram. Like, I could never have imagined that world, when I first started this, because it was risky. It was dangerous for a lot of us to be showing our faces and our identities at that time. And so because of that sort of long, knowledge that I have of this, I'm also extremely careful with people. But we haven't had anything happen, and I would like to keep it that way because of these kinds of stopgaps that we put in place. But we have been witness to organizations being raided by the police. We have been witness to people being put into rehabilitation centers. We've been part of teams because we are media people to try to figure out how to bring attention to some of these things. We've worked with organizations when, they've suddenly had, their bank accounts frozen, and how can we amplify that? So there's also all these other ways that we step in as media people to support what's going on in storytelling and the movements there on the continent. Ourselves, we've been able to tell these stories to, a lot of ways, not humanize, but really just try to show that queer people are part of this larger community that we have there. That's been our main focus and our goal in our work, to tell these stories in a way that kind of bridge the divide. But there are larger things at stake here. There's a lot happening. Yeah.
And a key takeaway with that is really just taking in that you have prepared for a lot of different situations that luckily have not arisen for you, but the fact to just be aware of what are potential consequences for people, because a lot of podcasters need to be aware of this, especially, I think we have a lot of podcasters that are listening from America, but that may be interviewing people from all over the world. And I think that's really important, just to keep all of this in mind and know the potential ramifications of this. Unfortunately, like you said, it's reality. It's unfortunately the world we live in right now. And, I kind of wanted to, just wrap up a little bit and hit on advice that you guys would like to pass along that maybe you haven't yet, or echoing something you said earlier that you really want people to remember for podcasters to incorporate inclusivity into their podcast strategy from the start, for people that are new podcasters, or if, they've been around like us for a while, just being able to integrate that better into their podcasting space. And obviously, especially with it being Pride Month, of having that focus of how to do this integration, inclusivity for the LGBTQIA plus community. Sean, did you want to start us out of just any closing thoughts you had surrounding advice?
Advice. Well, I'd say first of all, for anyone that wants to tell a story, it is an amazingly accepting space, and the fiction space is so vibrant and supportive for the most part, and amazing, right? So I would say tell your story. Connect to some other people and tell it. You can tell it, and it's a really neat journey, right? Personally too, to go on as a storyteller. Like that's how it changed me and my partner and how out we were. But on the industry side, I gotta go back to something that Sally said very early on. Like, dear Lord, LA and New York, like stop with the focus on the big, right? Like there are these vibrant, amazing communities with great reach, and there's just a blind spot to all of it, right? Like from fiction, I've certainly felt it in the fiction. I'm not going to speak for Sally, but I know Sally already spoke to it a little. But on the fiction side, right? Like there's no path to IP, right? It's just like everyone's telling their stories and they're growing and there's this community, but it's overlooked by most of the industry.
Yeah, no, it definitely is.
I agree
Sally,
with that.
what
I
are
think
your
there's such
closing
a focus
thoughts?
on monetization. I totally agree with that. I feel, being in LA right now, there's just such a focus on monetization. And I get it. But there's just so many fantastic stories. I think we're faced with this point now where it's like, okay, we're going to have to just do these things ourselves. We're going to have to tell these stories ourselves, raise the capital ourselves, and make this happen. And that's the space I've been in a long time, and I'm happy to stay here for a bit more. So I'm here for that. Bring back independent film. Yes, please. But in terms of advice I'd give to podcasters, I think, basically a lot of what Sean said, like if you have a story that you want to tell, just tell it, try telling it, and get it out there into the world. I mean, you will learn as you go. You'll make mistakes. You'll have incredible triumphs. It's just an incredible experience to be able to tell a story that matters to you, to support other people tell stories that matter to them. And so if that's the creative path that matters to you, if that's the thing that makes you happy, then tell the stories. And have fun. Please have fun, because when you get to the business side of this, it gets a little less fun, but so enjoy it while it's still fun. And make things, and we'll listen to them. So that's my advice.
Here.
Yes. Amazing. I think it's great when podcasting, it starts as a passion project, and if it becomes monetized and makes you money, wow, look at that. But I think it's a lot of shows, a lot of really good shows that I've really enjoyed over the last 18 years of listening to podcasts, that it comes back to, oh well, this started as a passion project. And many of them don't end up, making money, as far as I'm aware, as a listener. But yeah, those are the good shows and everything. So yeah, just wanted to thank everybody for tuning into this, and we just really much appreciate you taking the time as we kind of start to close out Pride Month, of being able to spotlight all of this. And Sean and Sally, thank you so much for providing your insight in all of this, and being in the community and being able to provide content that, gives a really good nod to our community, and being able to have that. So Norma Jean, please kind of officially close us out here.
I'm back. I'm back. This is fantastic. It's just been such a pleasure to hear all of you speak about, how to create that experience both within your shows and in the industry and your networks and all of that. So thank you all for being here. I'm going to read our brief outro, and then we will wrap up for today. Thank you everyone for joining us at Podcasting Smarter for our June live event. Podcasting with Pride, Strategies for Inclusive Representation, hosted by Kira Dineen of the DNA Today podcast and featuring Sally Cham, CEO and founder of AQ Studios, and Sean Howard, CEO and founder of Flight Path and co-founder of Fable and Folly. For those of you who may be joining us for the first time, Podcasting Smarter has live stream sessions just like this one with top podcasters and industry experts. We also have exclusive recorded episodes on the Podcasting Smarter podcast, so make sure to check that out as well. And I believe that Kira and Sally both have dedicated episodes on the podcast, so we'll pop the links for those to you here. This event is one of many resources and events that Podbean offers free of charge to empower you to launch and succeed in your podcasting journey. This event, we also have some great events coming up later in July on how to maximize video for your podcast and everyone's favorite topic, AI. Artificial intelligence. So if you joined late or you want to have another listen to this conversation, you can replay today's live stream on Podbean's YouTube channel and on that Podcasting Smarter podcast. We are brought to you today by Podbean. We're a podcast hosting and monetizing platform and home to over 640,000 podcasts. To start your podcast, head over to podbean.com today. And if you have any questions, you can always email us at podcastingsmarter@podbean.com. Thank you so much for joining us, and stay tuned for more podcasting tips and best practices this summer and on. Thanks again, everybody. It's been such a pleasure. Thanks, everybody.